Zach Laws of Gold Derby here with Jason Keller. He's one of the screenwriters on Fox's Ford v. Ferrari. And Jason, this isn't the first film we've seen with, a big race or a big game that's driving the action of the story. What about this one, though, stood out to you and made you want to, spend your time and your energy as a screenwriter bringing the story to cinemas?
It was the characters at the center of the story for me. When I first was introduced to this story and this era in racing, I became just, fascinated with these real life sort of heroes and explorers that were at the center of the story. Carroll, Shelby, Ken Miles. On the Ferrari side, there was, Ferrari. There was John Surtees, who was an iconic race car driver that drove for Ferrari at the time. It was really getting into those characters and what made them tick, and what compelled them to get into these cars that, were just at that time just death machines and do it over and over and over again. It was really the characters that jumped out at me.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about the movie is that when you boil it down, it's basically like a buddy movie, with Carroll Shelby, who's played by Matt Damon, and Christian Bale's character, Ken Miles. It's about like how these two disparate people who, fight, but also really respect each other, how they come together to create this car. So can you talk a bit about like just that relationship between those two characters and how you developed that?
Yeah, those two characters were those two, men were, just very different guys, and in many ways, I think that they needed each other to succeed. In Carroll Shelby, you had, really he was a showman, he was an impresario. He was a guy who was a very talented driver when he was a race car driver, but his real genius was bringing together other geniuses, to design and build cars, and he was very much he had an eye on the marketplace, and, he was a businessman. And so that was Carroll. And then you have Ken Miles, who he knew that there was no way that he was going to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish without Ken. And Ken was a virtuoso behind the wheel of a car, and a virtuoso designer and fabricator and mechanic. And he was a purist. And he was doing it not for the glory. He wasn't doing it for the money. In many ways, he wasn't even doing it for the checkered flag, I think. He was doing it for the perfection of building a race car and driving it to its limit. That's what Ken Miles was driven by. So you had these two guys that at many levels were diametrically different from one another, but that needed one another to pull this thing off. And so it was that push-pull and that difference of character that was just amazingly, fascinating to me when I first started to understand who these guys were.
Well, and what did you do in terms of research? Were there a lot of books or archival footage that you could find of these two guys that, helped you in cracking their characters?
Yeah, there certainly for Shelby, there's just, volumes and volumes written about the guy. He's an iconic, he's an iconic character in auto racing, and certainly that era of auto racing in many ways was defined by Carroll Shelby. Ken Miles, it was not so easy. I didn't know who Ken Miles was before I started to look into this story, and I don't think many people do. And there really wasn't much, if anything, written about him. There was, there were a few sort of anecdotal collections of stories, on him. I had met a couple of people who knew him back in the day, and they offered some insight into him. But his character was a more difficult character to crack, versus the Shelby character, which, there was just, you could go online right now and you could just see, hours and hours of footage of the guy. So, in terms of research, it was reading everything I could about Carroll Shelby, and it was trying to piece together, who Ken Miles was from, little snippets of stories here and there, and blurbs in racing magazines from the era, and it was a more challenging bit of research into Ken.
I have to wonder, in terms of challenging things to write. Obviously there is there's several race scenes in the movie, particularly the one that ends the film at Le Mans. How do you begin constructing something like that, as a writer?
Yeah, I mean, that was the tricky part. I think for everybody involved in this movie, throughout the entire development process, there's nothing terribly compelling about watching cars racing around a track. You have to become, emotionally invested in those drivers, and so early on in developing the movie and writing the movie, the mantra was always, it's got to be about character. We have to, at a character level, feel when a driver steps into a car and what is at risk. And I don't mean just his life, which was a real concern in this era and racing. It was at a character level, what was he putting on the line? Do you know what I mean? And, that was critical in infusing those races with an understanding that by the end of them, hopefully we come out understanding our characters more. That was critical. The races are exciting, and there were a lot of them back then, and there were certainly a lot of them during this era, during this time frame, which is roughly 64, 65, 66, that we don't see. So it was important to distill those races down to just the ones that were most important, and then infusing those races with enough character, conflict, and as we could, to make them, fun to watch, and feel them at a character level.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in a sense you're just like watching cars go around a loop over and over again, but like there has to be conflict within that. I mean, so I mean, those little bits and pieces of making it suspenseful. Where did those come from? Were there real life incidences that you were able to choose from, or did you have to kind of like dream them up on your own?
You mean within the races?
Right. Yeah. I mean, just like things like, I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, but it's interesting because like you do have to, you have to infuse it with some stakes other than just like who's going to win the race. Like, cause it's a huge set piece within the movie. Yeah.
Well, certainly Le Mans is a huge set piece within, this movie, and there are other races in this movie. I think that was a lot of the work in the writing and the developing of this screenplay. You had to understand, as I said, what's at stake for the character if they lose. A checkered flag is not interesting. And as you say, watching cars going around in a loop is not interesting. But if a character doesn't get to race, how does that affect us as an audience? If the character gets to race but doesn't finish, what does that do to him, at a personal level? If he loses or if he wins, how is that informing the struggle that we've been brought, that's been, sort of pulled through the movie up to that point? I mean, it was about looking at those races, in many ways, I thought about this movie as a war picture, because, you think about movies about World War II, or something, a battle is not interesting, but when you are invested in the soldiers and that they may or may not survive a battle, and what's at stake if they don't, the loved ones they'll leave, if they're killed, or whatever the plot is there, if they don't survive this, this struggle, then information will fall in the bad hand. Whatever it is, it's not about the battle. It's about, what's at stake if the battle, is a failure or success. I mean, that's how I thought about these races going into them. But it was really hard. I mean, I have to say, Zach, my original draft of this movie was 220 pages long.
Oh, wow.
Because in large part, the races were so compelling from a character standpoint that I didn't want to lose them. So, my early drafts were long because of exactly what we're talking about. It's like, how do you distill this down into one or two or maybe three very compelling, character-driven action sequences? And that was hard.
Yeah, I'll bet. I mean, I think one of the things that you're talking about in terms of like knowing what's at stake is that you do get a really good sense of like who these guys are outside of the track as well. And, you see a lot of Ken Miles's home life with his wife and his son. Can you talk about putting those elements into the story?
Well, I just, that character to me, people know of him now. I mean, it was one of those things where I started writing this movie almost 10 years ago. And when I first found out about, and I didn't know who Ken Miles was before I started writing this movie. And I was a race fan. I mean, I was born and raised in Indianapolis, and the Indianapolis 500 is a part of my growing up and my history, but I didn't know who Ken Miles was. When I started to dig into him, he was such a fascinating character to me. I mean, he was 46 years old before our movie begins, before our story begins, and this guy is considered one of the greatest race car drivers and, designers and mechanics that ever lived. I mean, you talk to current race car fans who know this world well, and they'll tell you that Ken Miles was the best of the best. I felt like I discovered the guy, and of course I didn't, but I felt like I had discovered, it was like discovering Mozart, and nobody knowing who Mozart was, discovering this virtuoso, behind the wheel of a car, who nobody knew, who had run out of time, who, was too old to really, be a player in racing at this time, who was broke, who had burned every bridge in his life up to that point. I mean, this was just a character that was so fascinating to me and compelling. And, if we're talking about, the racing in this movie, the stakes for Ken Miles when he stepped into a car at this time of his life was tremendous at a personal level. I mean, to win or lose for this guy, it was more than life or death for him. I mean, it was failure and obscurity, and this guy knew that he was one of the greatest. I mean, he really did, and everybody around him knew that he was one of the greatest, and he couldn't get out of his own way. And so, I wanted to infuse that in the driving in this movie or the races. And I tried to, make it so that an audience knew that every race for Ken Miles was make or break for him at a personal level. Because I think it was for this guy. And so he was actually the easier character, in terms of, if we're talking about racing sequences, he, for me, was an easier character to get under the skin of when it came to these races, because I could just sense how important a win was for this guy at a personal level, and hopefully it comes through.
Considering that you've been working on this script for a decade now, and it's been through so many different hands and so many different directors and actors, what did you think the first time that you finally saw it on screen?
You know, I was really blown away when I saw it for the first time, and I saw it. I didn't see it in an audience. I didn't see it with an audience. I saw it by myself in a theater at the Fox lot, and of course, you know, I knew the story and knew what was going to happen. But there's so much emotion. You know, as a writer, you know, it's a very internal world that I live in, you know, and these characters all, I did feel a real connection to these characters, having worked on this movie for a long time. But when I saw the movie and I saw Matt Damon and Christian Bale bring these guys to life, and I saw what James Mangold had done with the racing, and I saw how emotional this movie was, it wasn't a surprise to me, but I was moved so deeply by the story that I had spent a decade thinking about, and these characters that I had spent a decade thinking about. So, you know, to answer your question, when I first saw the movie, I was blown away, and was so relieved that others would have a chance to experience this story that I had lived with, you know, alone in front of a computer screen or with books for years and years and years. I was so happy that others were going to meet these characters and hopefully feel about them the way that I had felt about them for so many years. It was just, you know, it was amazing. And it was a testament to everybody who built the movie beyond me. I mean, you know, this is all about, you know, amazing acting. This is all about tremendous, you know, directing. You know, it was a super cool moment for me to see the movie and be blown away.
Have you had a chance to see it with an audience yet?
Yeah, I saw it at the world premiere in Toronto with a fantastic audience. I saw it here a couple weeks ago again. So I've had a chance to see it, and that's another experience. I mean, it was seeing it in Toronto for the first time with an audience, and seeing how they reacted was, you know, it was just it was really great. I loved it.
Well, it's a great movie, and Jason Keller, thank you so much for your time. I'm glad that your 10-year journey has finally found its way to the finish line, to use a pun from the movie. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Zach. Have a good
You're
day.
welcome. You too. Thank you. Thanks to all you at home for watching. Make sure you click the like and subscribe button below, and make sure you visit us at goldderby.com for all the latest Oscar news.